So Time magazine critic Richard Corliss once described Paul Rudnick's writing as a party wine with a bouquet of sentiment and the kick of hard truth. Paul has had an amazing career, writing groundbreaking plays like Jeffrey, crowd-pleasing Hollywood entertainments like Sister Act and Addams Family Values, and widely praised novels, including his latest, What Is Wrong with You? It's great. I just finished it. We're going to talk about it during the program. Plus, I love the way he has used comedy to respond to political turmoil. I also have a question. Why is he still posting on X? It's a delight to welcome Paul Rudnick to At Lunch. Welcome, Paul.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me here. What a treat.
It's great to have you. So, a lot of things I want to talk to you about, but let's start with those posts on X, which I saw you were busy doing this morning.
I was.
So tell me but seriously, what is it about that process of posting stuff that that you like, and why do you do it?
Well, I think I like it. Well, initially, it's certainly gotten far darker than this, but it initially was a kind of a town square where everybody could chime in constantly. And also, you got very immediate news reporting. If you wanted to know about the broken water main or the airplane crash or anything else, that's where you went. And since then, it's morphed continually. And I know a lot of people left for sort of kinder and gentler sites, but I kind of like still being embedded on enemy turf, in Elonville. And just personally, there's an immediacy. When you write books or plays or anything else, there's a huge time lag. You wait months, if not years, to finally see the work and see if people are going to enjoy it. On X, you can, although I keep wanting to keep calling it Twitter, the way I wanted to keep calling it the Gulf of Mexico. But I like just joining in. And the fact that, although sometimes you do have to always have that little mechanism in your brain that says, other people can see this and it's going to be here forever. So when you see the people saying, the most foul, idiotic things, you think, does it occur to them that their mom is going to take a look? But yeah, I kind of enjoy the instant coffee quality of it, that it's really, and that it's what I think Tom Stoppard, the wonderful playwright, once called a gag reflex, where you just keep joking helplessly. And that's what X is made for. I like actually also the technical constraints, the fact that you don't have that many words or letters and that everything's going to be replaced within a few seconds. So that's a nice challenge.
Yeah, no, and I do love your post, I have to tell you, because I think like a lot of people, at least everybody I know, people have been in sort of this panic mode for the last few weeks. And I think just reading somebody like you who's very smart about politics and an astute observer of society, but you're also funny. And so I think there is something good to say, we got to laugh about this, even as we cry. So that brings me to the last Trump presidency and coastal elites, which is, for those of you who didn't have a chance to see it, it's still available on HBO and really great. And it came out when the pandemic began. Remember the pandemic 4 or 5 years ago? And it's funny. So on Valentine's Day, weirdly, my husband and I watched Coastal Elites, and it was so great. Bette Midler's in it and Dan Levy. It's really terrific. But it was also pretty disturbing to watch it the second time around. And I mean the second time around with Trump, because so many of the themes it elicits are being reenacted in an even stronger way now. And so I wanted you to talk about what was it that led you to do it the first time around and how it feels different or the same to you now.
Well, it kind of erupted because this was right before the first Biden election, when I, along with every other human being I knew, was in this helpless, dithering panic mode where the anxiety level was just so through the roof. And so I just responded to it the only way I knew how, especially because there's one piece in it that Midler appears in it and it's just magnificent, where about a woman in New York who goes into her local Starbucks and there's always a guy with a MAGA hat there. And that actually was happening to me at that time. There was a guy at my little 11th Street coffee shop who had the MAGA hat, and there was, so every time I saw him, it was a decision of, do you take the bait? Do you get into it? Do you allow yourself to, have that level of public breakdown? And so I channeled it into these monologues. And originally we were going to stage them live at the Public Theater with Jay Roach, a wonderful director, doing it and tape it for HBO. And then that was exactly when the pandemic hit. So it got shut down, and I thought, oh, this is dead. And then HBO called up and said, what if we film this remotely? And it was still in those early days. So everything anyone sees there was shot in the homes of the stars, of Sarah Paulson and Bette and Dan Levy and Issa Rae and everybody else. And Jay was in one, I forget where, he was in another state entirely, by which I mean the United States. And I was in New York, and we were on at least like 5 different apps all the time. So it was the most insane way to shoot something, but everyone was in that mode of just the highest possible worry and concern for our country. So they were all in, and these were long monologues, and every actor was memorized every word, and we just were sort of all frazzled together. So, and I do like to think that we were responsible for Biden being elected and Trump being trounced. And that's why I felt bad. I felt, oh, if only I'd done a follow-up, I could have helped out. But no, I think it's interesting because now when I think of the national mood or the Manhattan mood or whatever however we're going to narrow it, it's gotten, there's an even deeper level of despair, and also a strange sense of endlessness, of okay, of helpless, what do we do now? And that's another reason I post on X, as you were saying, because I think it could be funny, and there are only so many times you can shriek the truth, and it is the truth, and just imagine that Trump is going to respond and say, you know what, Paul Rudnick, you're right about that. I regret everything I've ever done. So that's where comedy, I think, becomes kind of essential. And on Coastal Elites, and it was divisive. We had people who adored it and people who identified completely and felt it was like intravenous comedy. And then people who were outraged because everyone, when you wander into political turf, everyone has a very strong opinion. But yeah, it was still very gratifying to do because you thought, okay, at least as a historical artifact, this is where people's brains were, a certain segment of the population's brains were at that particular moment. And there was a level of terror that I had not experienced to that point, or a variety of terror, because having lived through, the AIDS crisis and plenty of 9/11, yeah, there's a tsunami along every second. But that moment was, it was just so personal to people, and I think remains so. And why wouldn't it be?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I do recommend, in addition to reading Paul's book, that you also take a look at Coastal Elites. It's really good. I mean, just the content and it's funny and it's brilliant, but it's also a reminder of, yeah, for a couple of years, this is how we watched drama during the pandemic, and the performances are just wildly great. So that's
Oh yeah. Oh, thank you.
so so I want to talk to you about Libby Gelman-Waxner. So I have to tell you, I discovered her back when I was a film critic for the Wall Street Journal. And, I used to look around to see what other people were doing. And Libby wrote about movies for Premiere Magazine. And those of you who don't know, she had this sort of special Jewish American princess take on things. And I thought she was so funny, and I thought she was real. And then one day I was talking to somebody and I said, oh my God, I'd just love to meet her and see what she's like. And he said, she's actually Paul Rudnick. And I felt like such an idiot, that I didn't know, but there was no internet in the way there is now. So you could just look stuff up. And also just completely blown away by it because she's so authentic in her craziness. And so if you could just talk about, and then she had a very long career as a film critic. And I wondered if you could just tell people how, people may have seen her in the New Yorker and all kinds of places. Could you tell us how she came into being and the role she's played in your career?
Oh yeah, no, it was very Byzantine. This was 30 years ago, more than that, when Premiere Magazine, which was just beginning at that time, approached me and asked, did I want to be a film critic? And I thought, no, the world has more than enough film critics at the moment. But then I asked, well, what about someone slightly fictional? And Libby burst forth. And what I loved is that she has no censor. And she just says, she responds the way I think a lot of us do before we slap ourselves. She responds to, okay, do I want to live in that character's apartment? Do I want to wear Diane Keaton's outfit? Do I want to go out with Brad Pitt? So it's all very visceral. And I think that's why people responded, because there was a sort of honesty to it. But what was interesting was that for the first few years, no, everyone thought she was real. And she would get marriage proposals, which I always loved.
Mhm.
There was one, oh my God, it was from this man who said that he was a senior at Yale and a part-time male model. And he said he would abandon his girlfriend if Libby would marry him. And I checked him out. It was all true. He really was this great looking guy. Yeah. And then about a year after that, I met him just in New York, the way you meet people. And I thought, okay, which is more embarrassing? Being that guy who proposed to a fictional female movie critic or being the fictional female movie critic. So we just kind of let it go. We thought, no, this was just a moment in both our lives. But it was wonderful to have that the freedom of a character to write in that voice where I didn't have to worry about being a responsible film critic. And she once got nominated for an ASME Award. Do you remember those?
Yes, I do.
This is also back in the age of magazines, which was so wonderful and dearly missed. And there aren't any anymore. There are like 3 left. And I do remember, well, that was what was fun. I remember when she didn't win the ASME Award, someone who wrote for Scientific American did, and Libby attacked him in print, and said, how dare he? Who cares about quantum physics? I was writing about Mariah Carey's film debut. So it was it was a treat. And she still once in a while will cry. She wrote for Entertainment Weekly for a while. This was after Premiere folded. And she was a very popular segment of Premiere. She got a huge amount of mail and stuff. So although I also did love people who didn't quite realize that it was satiric, who would write and say, why do you just talk about what people are wearing and where they're going for brunch? You should go read a little Francois Truffaut. And I love that gap between those people and a sense of humor. But then gradually people became more aware. And actually was sweet. I knew people who were on tour with Broadway musicals who would read it aloud to each other in character. Um,
That's, I
so
love that.
I think she'll go on because you always need a little Libby.
We definitely need a lot of Libby. So speaking of
Okay.
Libby, one of my favorite Libby headlines was Goyim of the Galaxy. And that was her review of Guardians of the Galaxy. For those of you who aren't superhero fans, it was a huge blockbuster about a decade ago about superheroes. And then I noticed that you have kind of an obsession with superheroes because in Coastal Elite, the actor played by Dan Levy is auditioning to play the first gay superhero. And in your new book, What is Wrong with You? One of the main characters plays a superhero. So tell me, what is it, Paul, about you and superheroes?
Oh, because I have just the most populist taste in movies. I love most of the Marvel movies, and I really love all the Mission Impossible movies and a lot of Arnold and all of that stuff. I just go for it. And because I've got a lot of actor friends from my time in the theater and movie making, I'm so fascinated by what part of their brain needs to engage when you're playing something that's sort of human, not quite human, that has to deliver the most absurd lines in total sincerity. It's why I think people don't always appreciate Tom Cruise, that when he says things like, we've got company, or, get lost, Buster, that you think, those lines are ridiculous and impossible to say, and he makes you buy it, at least for that split second. So there was that fascination. And then, of course, there was the sense that I don't know if we're ever going to see a Jewish superhero. God knows we could use one. Well, there's the wonderful Michael Chabon book, Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which
Yeah.
deals with how the Jewish men who were initially responsible for the comic books that gave birth to Batman and Superman and Spider-Man and all of that, and how that's part of, the great American narrative, that where these immigrant stories that became these enormous Goyische blockbusters. So it just seems like such an American form, right up there with, musical theater and jazz, that we made that for better or for worse. And I usually can't get enough. I think especially, although it's so funny when you talk about in times of distress where we need an escape, we need entertainment. When isn't it a time of distress? That but those movies, when they really work, when they're, in the hands of great filmmakers, oh my God, there's no ride like that. Um, and it's fun to, as a novelist, especially when you think, okay, can you aspire to a certain level of suspense or emotion or comedy that you usually only get on the screen or on stage? Can you expand things to that level? So writing about Sean, who is a guy who's a sort of retired superhero, who did his bit, and now runs a chain of New York gyms. And because I know guys who've done quite similar things, and it's interesting also because they have followings, they can go to Comic-Con, they can, they're a little bit typed for the rest of their life as whatever, super abilities they had.
Yeah, no, great. So I want to continue on this line, but somebody just posted a question for you that I think would be interesting for you to answer. People on Blue Sky repost your Twitter comments, also still Twitter, but we who are reading and laughing at them can't engage with you because we won't go on that site anymore. Can you consider posting on Blue Sky so your many fans can tell you how much they like what you write?
Oh, well, that is incredibly sweet, and I'm so grateful for that. Yeah, because the only reason I haven't sort of started on both is because of a slight exhaustion factor. So I think I am going to start posting more directly on Blue Sky because that would be wonderful. But yeah, but it just kind of so many hours in the day. And I also post on Facebook and Instagram, and I have my own website at paulrudnick.com. So I would like to very much because I think Blue Sky is fantastic, and I know other people have sometimes put some of my stuff on Threads as well. But yeah, it's just there's so many options out there. And X was just the one that sort of hit first and where I, got a batch of followers. And it's yeah, and also there is something weirdly and perversely fun about being able to provoke some of the right-wing hardliners on X who just are outraged by everything, and they have very limited means of expression. They always say things like, well, you're stupid, or cry more libtard tears, and you think, gee, you're really a cultural monument, aren't you? But also I like the idea of finding out. I know what my friends think, and I think Blue Sky is a wonderful resource. But on the other hand, people tend to be in agreement. And on X, it's the opposite. So that I think it's important to always be aware, even if they're going to ignite you, what the enemy is saying. And once in a while, there are people who are reasonable, who can have a nuanced view of things. Maybe there may be two of those.
Thank you. Thank you from the audience. Anybody else who has any questions, please post them and I'll try to get them in if I can. So going back to Libby for a second, not that I'm going to make this all about Libby, but it isn't. But in the opening line of her review, or your review of Guardians of the Galaxy, she asked, have you ever noticed there are almost never any Jews in outer space? Now, that was written before Marjorie Taylor Greene, I guess, because I guess there are Jews in outer space. But being Jewish permeates your writing. And we are at the American Jewish Historical Society, at least virtually. What does being Jewish mean to you as a person? And I guess as a child and now as an adult?
Oh, an enormous amount. Well, one thing that once happened that I always treasure is that I did a big overhaul on the first Addams Family movie, and then I wrote Addams Family Values all by myself. And I was interviewed by the Jewish Daily Forward. And the reporter asked me if the Addams family were Jewish. And I thought about it and I said, do you want them to be? Because I thought it's an interesting conundrum given that they are homicidal maniacs. But no, I grew up in New Jersey in a, kind of a secular Jewish household where the rule was no Christmas trees, no Volkswagens, but you could still go to Rockefeller Center at Christmas time. There was a cultural focus that I just so appreciate more and more as time goes by. There was an introduction to theater, to museum going, to books, just the sense of prominence on those and those fields that just meant the world to me. And I thought, and my parents made sure that I went, that I enjoyed it, that it became a part of my life. And yes, I'm sure that's true for the Goyim as well. But in my house, there was also a sense that authors were to be cherished, which is why my parents loved when I worked in the theater and movies, but books were everything, because that was the Jewish touchstone. And when I wrote a book, my mother could go to the bookstore and put it in front of other people's books. My mom, no longer with us, but she was the office manager at a magazine called Partisan Review, which in its moment was a very prominent literary magazine. So she got to meet some of her heroes, and we got free books, which was even better. So she, said, this is John Updike, this is Philip Roth, this is Joan Didion, this is Sylvia Plath. And I just absorbed that even as a very young child, that, okay, these are names and people you should remember and people you should read. My mom, one of the other things I loved about her was when she would try desperately and hopelessly to be a decent Jewish mother of a previous generation, when she would try to make challah, things like that. And she would usually give up about halfway through and just say, I can't do this. It was just, she wanted to go read the art section of the New York Times. Which I feel is a supreme expression of Judaism. So there was that. There were also, I guess, one of the things I loved most was the sense of humor. That my mom had two sisters and the three of them became this version of the Marx Brothers, which in a very early novel of mine called I'll Take It, I tried to sort of capture those rhythms. And of course, after the book came out, my mother said, well, it's all true, but you made us sound too Jewish. And I thought, only a real Jewish person would say something like that. So that it just kind of infused everything, that when we would have our Passover Seder, there would be a lot of chatter going on that was, let's say, a little irreligious, which I just adored, the fact that they could make jokes about Moses and the commandments and everything else. And that, because, there's that great Jewish tradition of laughter through suffering. But going on, I mean, it's funny because Julie, as I'm sure many people know, wrote a superb biography of the brilliant playwright Wendy Wasserstein. And I remember, I think we even talked about this, when Wendy was writing The Sisters Rosenzweig, one of her greatest plays, she had spent a lot of time in London. And I remember she told me that when she was in London, when she would say something funny or something political, often English people would look at her and they'd enjoy it, but they'd say, oh, that's so New York. And she knew what that was code for, which was that's so Jewish. And it was interesting that even for a woman of her accomplishments and preeminence as a writer, that there was still that need to compartmentalize and even insult her that way. But that's, I mean, again, one of the things that's amazing about Judaism is that it lets you explore every aspect of, happiness and its opposite. And it's funny because even right now, whenever there's a flashpoint in Jewish history, everyone's asked for an opinion. And then I always think, when haven't we been at a flashpoint in Jewish history? It's not like things were fine for a couple of months there. But it's a tradition that I think is so varied and so extraordinary and so sheerly entertaining that I'm just thrilled to be a part of it. And there's a Jewish dentist in the new book, in What Is Wrong with You? There are two dentists, but only one of them is Jewish. But the tradition of Jewish professionals is, very dear to my heart. I'm married to a doctor who isn't Jewish. But when I was first going out with John, and we've been together like 32 years, I called my mother and I said, "Oh, I met the most wonderful man." And she was all excited. And I said, "He's handsome and he's funny and he's a doctor." And oh my God, you could hear the ecstasy through the phone. And then she took a pause and she said, "Is he Jewish?" And I took a pause and said, "Well, no, actually, he's not." And she paused again and then said, "Is he smart?" And I almost hung up. I said, "No, he got his degree from a matchbook cover." But and my mother was a very smart, very, well-read and educated woman. And she still had that sense of, slight suspicion there. And although later when she was very ill, but I always enjoyed this when would go to her doctor in Manhattan. She would bring with her my partner, John, a doctor, and her nephew, Carl, my cousin, who's also a doctor. She brought two doctors with her, like handbags. And I felt bad for her actual doctor because he had to put up with this little armada that was, in her wake. But so that's, how can you not love my mom and Jews in general? Although Lord knows there are plenty of people who can't.
So I just have to tell you, I was telling Paul before we opened up today that my memory of interviewing him for the Wendy Wasserstein book was laughing for 2 hours. And now I'm remembering why, because who else can come up with a line? She brought two Jewish doctors with her, like handbags, just like that. That was so good. Before we go on, somebody named Rhoda Ribner sends you a message saying, "Thanks for the memories of Selma Rudnick. I remember her fondly from my bitter brief tenure at Partisan Review." So there you go. Somebody who knew
Oh,
your
well, you were
mom.
so welcome. I love that you remember her and the magazine. And it's funny, she also, for years, she was the publicist for the Pennsylvania Ballet. And this is apropos of almost nothing, but Lourdes Lopez, who just retired from or left the Miami Ballet,
Yeah.
she was at the Pennsylvania. So my mom knew all these dance world figures. And when she was on her lunch break, she would bring her folding chair down the hall and watch Baryshnikov rehearse. So speaking of, Jewish cultural heritage, that, she brought it. Although she once did something diabolical to me, which was she asked if she was in Philadelphia and asked if I could do an errand and bring a manila envelope of photo portraits of a lot of the dancers to her on the train. And at the last minute, I said, sure. And she said, "Oh, and by the way, there are a lot of nudes." And the envelope was sealed. And of course, I then had to spend the whole train trip saying, "Why did my mother tell me these are naked pictures of dancers and expect me not to open it?" So there was a darkness there, but I can't, to this day, I can't remember if I opened it. I assume I did. But yeah, so she was all about culture in every aspect.
That is great. So I told you we were going to talk about what is wrong with you. And as I said, I had a really great time reading it. I was sad when it was over because it was such a nice relief to have this funny book to read. And so it is funny and it feels like a comic romp, but it's also really serious. It's like you, funny serious, right? It covers death, divorce, fidelity, and cancel culture, which I thought was very interesting. And so I think it's just interesting to know, and maybe some of you don't know because obviously this stuff just pours out of you, but like, where did the idea for this book in particular come from? And what was sort of your process of
Well,
writing it?
yeah, it's funny. During the pandemic, I wrote a novel called Farrell Covington and the Limits of Style that
Yeah.
just poured out of me. I started a kind of a different book, and this suddenly took flight, and I just surrendered and had the very best time. And for the first time, a lot of my work in the theater, I hadn't been pleased with. I thought, no, I somehow could not express the things I was after. And suddenly, when I was writing a novel, it all fit. And once I finished that book, What is Wrong with You began actually, read something online, someone's blog post, someone who I didn't know, who was clinically depressed. He talked about, he was like, had just turned 50 or something and hated his life, hated everything, felt there was no hope for him. And it was very sad. I mean, I thought, I didn't think he was suicidal, but I thought, well, that's an interesting starting point to see someone with that sort of sadness to him. And then as I was writing the book, I thought, oh, I can't leave him there. I thought, okay, I want this book to explore the possibility of happiness, the possibility of romance in a way that the reader will actually accept. Because I think we're all very cynical. We've all been through a lot. And I didn't want this to be fantasy, or I didn't want this to be a throwaway. So, and there was suddenly this particular group. This was one of the first things I've written that had a very wide range of characters coming from gay, straight, men, women, every economic category, every social class. And I thought, what brings these people together? And that was the joy of it for me. I thought, oh, okay, it's like an Altman movie. It's that sense of people encountering other folks that they think might be their enemy, might be their love of their life, and figuring out how those pieces fit. And that was, again, I tend not to outline or diagram. It was something where the characters kept galloping ahead of me, and I just held on for dear life. And that was, is my favorite mode of writing. So it was, and they end up at a place that's not purely joyous, not purely horrific, because they go through, and it very much ended up centering on all the permutations of love, which includes
Yeah.
widowhood, which includes divorce, which includes parenthood. So that I thought these are the universal themes that everybody wrestles with, and to one degree or another. And that gave it a size, because as you said, I didn't want it to be, I actually didn't even intend it to be funny. I mean, that's always kind of a bonus. I just sort of plunge in. And as for cancel culture, there, especially if you're anywhere in the arts, there are going to be sensitivity editors. There are you'll have intimacy coordinators. You're going to have readers on various, book buyer websites who can get books actually canceled. And I think that's a very dangerous time. I think sometimes there are very legitimate points being made in terms of content. But on the other hand, the answer, I think, is never censorship. The answer is always more voices and a wide variety. And yes, you're allowed to object to anything you like, but you are not allowed to erase it. So, it's a very, and this is coming from both the right and the left. It's so fascinated me that that's the point where they meet sometimes, is in trying to shut writers and actors down. And I thought, but that's also hilarious, because you think when people get very incensed by, a syllable or a hyphen or or something they don't even they didn't understand, a foreign phrase that they mistranslated, they're hilarious, because they become very humorless. I think that, and I think also the idea that there are now jobs that a person could hold where you go through manuscripts to, hunt out the incorrectness or the inauthenticity. And I thought, so much of that is in the eye of the beholder, especially if you're writing comedy. You got to be very careful about shutting people down because you think, honey, well, that's on X. You just want to say, honey, it's a joke. Because one of my favorite things in life, it's always when people don't realize something was a joke. If you say there were a tetrazillion reasons, and they think you actually meant that there's some number that's a tetrazillion, and you think, okay, how do you cross the street in the morning, if everything is serious to you? So that was how What Is Wrong with You came into being. And it's funny, at one point, the original title was Life as We Fucking Know It, which is the title of a book that one of the characters writes. But you're not going to get that on every bookstore shelf or every Amazon listing. And then What Is Wrong with You became far more my favorite, because it's something that people say to me and people get said to each other all the time, where they just stare at you and go, what is wrong with you?
Yes.
Whatever your opinion of a meal or a politician or a movie might be, when they're just dumbfounded and think, how can you be so unlike me? So it just, It was a pleasure to, well, there was, I shouldn't be doing this, but I will. There was just a wonderful, a starred review in Kirkus for the book where they said that What Is Wrong with You is, I think, the cure for your bad mood. And I just loved that. I thought, oh my God, if I could do that for someone, that's the best, that's the mitzvah of all time, you know? Whereas,
Well,
you know,
it is the mitzvah of all time, and I I felt so much that way. It just made me feel happy for that time. I was reading it every night, and in the book, I had sent, I think I sent you an email, but this, you have this great line where one of the characters is this young writer who comes to New York for the first time and she encounters Times Square and she says, "Oh my God," she says, "Times Square looks like the inside of my mind." And then you wrote back to me and you said, "Yeah, that's it. It looks like the inside of my mind." And I did want you to talk about the place where you're sitting, your apartment, which I have to say was one of the more incredible. When I interviewed you there, it was an incredible apartment. It's sort of like this Gothic palace of some kind. And um, and that together with your eating habits, which I've read about, which are really interesting. Like, yeah, I think there's a heavy emphasis on candy and Pringles, potato chips. So, if you were pitching a play about this Paul Rudnick character, how would you describe him?
oh my God, it would be science fiction. It would be the next step beyond romantasy. Well, my apartment, which is what is so bizarre, is that I'm living, as you remember, a actually modern building. It was from the 1970s that had originally been a women's prison. And then it was converted into co-ops. And I live in one. And I just thought, no, I can't have just modern blank walls. I need a little theater. And this is why you could see from what's behind me, it's now gotten to the sort of Dumbledore hoarder point where I think now it looks like everything's going to fall on me. And I'll be buried alive. But it's, and also I'm sort of proud that I'm one of the people who still have, handwritten and Xerox drafts from so long ago when people had handwriting and Xerox machines. And it's just ain't now I do everything, of course, online. But but yeah, I remember the first time my mom came to my apartment, and where I do have a lot of Gothic furniture just because I just liked it. I thought I know it. I had a theory back then that I knew a lot of visual artists, and they tended to live in very blank white walled spaces because they deal with their eyes and focus on a canvas or a sculpture all day long. So they want to rest. But because I'm always just in my head as a writer, I like to look up and see the busiest possible world. And when you have a lot of Gothic furniture and a lot of wallpaper, that immediately takes you away from whatever is bedeviling you. But my mom came in and she looked around and she said, "Paul, why do you have the Pope's furniture?" And I thought, that's exactly right. But she immediately went and sat on a very heavily carved throne. She had no problems with the self-confidence needed to be absolutely regal. So yeah, it just is, it's just something to enjoy. I mean, I always think everything where you live, what you wear, what you eat is a choice. So why not enjoy it as much as possible? It's like my eating habits when people say, how can you eat so much candy? How can you live on a sort of 24-hour a day breakfast? It's like, why wouldn't you? You know, it tends to disturb people, but there is a vast underground of which is most actually probably most people on earth who live on sugar. Also, and the one thing I learned, which I love, is that if you've lived long enough, there will be articles telling you that refined sugar will kill you instantly. And then you wait a while and they say, well, no, it's actually not so bad for you, just like with wine and coffee. Um, Although someone once did, when they heard my eating habits, they said, Paul, the good thing is that when you die, you'll already be embalmed. I thought, okay, that's a little gloomy, but I would welcome it. Why not? I'll save the mortician a step. But it's yeah, no, and eventually it's like when I was a very young child and my parents were a little worried about me on every possible level. And the shrink, God bless this guy, he sent me home after about 3 sessions and said, he seems pretty happy. And I thought that's the best thing you could say, especially about a kid, where you say, stop worrying. This is not your fault. He's not harming anyone. He's not playing with knives. Leave him alone. And they did. And I've always been quite grateful for that.
Oh, that's great. I love that. So we're crazily getting towards the end, and I just wanted to quickly tell you just a few things people have been posting. Somebody saying that I want to thank you for the history of gay New York culture, for your characters, and in general for this book. He's talking about Farrell in that one. And then somebody else says, you're allowed to object to anything you like, but you're not allowed to erase it, quoting you. Thank you. So a lot of people are, and then somebody, my grandma was Selma, and I was named after her. There's a lot of people weighing in on things you're saying with great happiness. Um, and, you know, somebody early on had asked, we've gone from terror to grief. And I think that you touched on all of those things. You really write quite beautifully in What Is Wrong with You about grief, about what it feels like to lose somebody who you love. And but it's also about keep going, right? And so I guess it would be great to hear in general. I mean, you've touched on it, but the role that art has played for you as a grounding force, and also like in that world of art, what's been the biggest influence on you?
Well, art has always been so beyond essential, because sometimes when I'm getting very Marxist about life and I think, oh, it's so unnecessary, it changes nothing. It's just this useless form of dessert. And then I imagine the world without it, and not just for myself, but for anyone. I think everyone looks to some form of art or entertainment or dance or music that gets them through. And I think at various points, it changes for me, which I love, that there will be a novel, there will be Edith Wharton, there will be Patrick Dennis, there will be all sorts of people who make me aware of a world that I can aspire to, or a world that I can exult in. Going to the theater as a kid, especially musical theater, and this is, quite common, there was a level of joy and of excitement of when you sit in that audience and there's an overture or there's a red velvet curtain and you're waiting to see what will happen next. And it's a live event that's shared by, this everyone sitting beside you. I thought, oh, okay, everything in my world and my life just got kicked up so many notches, and it becomes an addiction. And then when I'm reading, and especially I love reading on trains, because for some reason, if I read in cars, I get carsick. But on a train, I get lost, and suddenly it's 2 hours later, and I'm at my destination. And I love that feeling of, very wonderfully drowning in someone else's story, and of learning things without learning painlessly in a way, or if there's pain, it's the best sort, where you realize, oh, okay, this is something you need to go through. But yeah, it's such a lifeline. And I was so lucky. I mean, from when I first started to meet other writers and other singers and dancers, things like that, and to be able to learn about their lives and to befriend them, that was such a childhood fantasy, that there was this, and a lot of it's linked to New York, of course, because I'm such a New York chauvinist, where I think, oh my God, I got to meet Wendy Wasserstein or Chris Durang, or could the wonderful director Christopher Ashley, or any number of other wonderful performers and theater people and movie. And well, I love movie making too, but it's a little less inclusive in that way, to use a forbidden word. With theater also, nobody's making any money, so the friendships sort of are a little more, a little deeper. And with books, what I love is when someone reads something I've written, whoever that was who just said something nice about Farrell Covington, if that actually, if someone gets it, if it moves someone, if it makes them laugh, there's no high like it. When someone writes something nice about something a book I've written, I just, oh my God, I go for days on it. And then when someone writes something mean, I of course assume they're a horrible human being and with deep emotional problems. But yeah, but this is because with What Is Wrong with You, I'm at that point now where people are just beginning to read the book for when it comes out on March 25th, and can be pre-ordered on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and everywhere else.
And in the chat we have where you can just press the
Great.
link and order it immediately. and our time is up, which I'm so sad about. And
Oh,
I'm gonna go have a bowl of candy for lunch.
that sounds right. Me too. I
Thank
hope
you,
I've been the
Paul.
worst possible influence.
You have been, and it's been
Oh,
great.
good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.